Welcome to Wine Talks with Paul, Callum, Karen. Man, this is an exciting day for us because we had a surprised guests, actually, not guests. Wine Talks is available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and Stitcher. And of course, always sponsored by the Original Wine of the Month Club, now sporting the new Pure Wine Series Club, where we feature organic and biodynamic wines. But let's get to the subject at hand because this is very interesting for me. Old friends of my wife, right? Viken,
we've been classmates at Glendale High School.
Glendale High School, right?
Yes.
So this is Viken and Vahe Yacoubian, and they have ventured out into what I would consider what it might have been originally a pretty risky environment, but did it for passion. And Viken was just telling me the story about how they had to start a relationship with the great Paul Hobbs, one of the great consulting winemakers in America. So let's go back to that. So you which I think is very funny. You were drinking a bottle of Pinot Noir.
Yes.
From Paul Hobbs.
Yes. And obviously at the end of the night we enjoyed the wine a lot. I was with my wife, and I think it might have been even for our wedding anniversary. So by the time we were home, I was happy enough from the wine, and I
good business
loved
decisions,
it very
right?
much. Yes. So I just shot a poetic email to the winery because I had not really drank a Paul Hobbs Pinot Noir. I've had the Cab before, and I sang the praises of the wine, and probably because of my tipsiness, it was kind of poetic. And the next morning in my inbox, lo and behold, Paul Hobbs had responded from his personal email.
And you don't think that this is because of the Glendale High School education that this letter was so well crafted?
Possibly.
Could be, huh?
Possibly, could be. Your wife might have influenced
yes,
me.
that's
Yes.
Well, she likes to criticize my writing, that's for sure.
I did not know much English when I started Glendale High School, so yes, I'm sure that was an important thing. So, he responded, and we started talking. It was a Cuvée Agustina, which is his higher line Pinot Noir, and Agustina is his daughter. And he also said, my daughter read your email. I think she was 15 at that time, and hence the relationship started.
So
that was the beginning.
What year
this
was
that? I believe it was in 2004.
Oh, so it's quite a while ago.
Yeah, quite a while ago, and then. From that point on, we started a conversation. As you know, Paul Hobbs is really one of the pioneers in Argentina as well.
That's true.
When he went in Argentina in the 80s and worked with Catena family and then started Viña Cobos. So in some ways, he's an explorer, and he's very much interested in new regions.
You sounded like, though, when you started the conversation off camera here, that you're a bit of an enophile yourself. You enjoy fine wine, or you always have, or is this something?
We grew up in Lebanon, and as you know, Lebanon was a French protectorate until 1952, and they have a
before
longer.
No, 40s.
No, until 52, right? Or
40s.
40s, okay. So from First World War, and they have a great wine culture. As you know, Lebanon has great wines. And my dad his education was in France, and he was a great wine lover. So when we were kids in Lebanon, he would take us to the Bekaa Valley once a year, and we would pick up our stash for the entire year.
Yeah, that's great.
So we went from one winery to the next, from Casara to Tourelle, and so on and so forth. That was imprinted on me, and it became part of my existence when I was 6 years old.
That's a very, I'm going to tell you a story. It's a very important part of what's happened to you now, because it's part of particularly the French and the Italians. When you're a child, wine is part of your lifestyle.
Absolutely.
But we were in San Francisco recently. There's a new Armenian restaurant, and the guy, I can't remember his name now. It's just opened about 6 weeks to 8 weeks ago. And it's very eclectic Armenian food, very continental Armenian food, European style. And the guy worked everywhere. He worked at Per Se. He worked at the famous Spanish restaurant. And I've never seen a wine list like this in my life. And how long I've done this, and I've tasted many Lebanese wines, not a lot, but it's many. I didn't recognize anything on this list. He had Turkish wine. He had Armenian wine. He had I don't know, maybe a dozen Lebanese wines. So are there really that many
Wow.
wineries in Lebanon that you?
Many,
Oh,
many
yeah.
wineries in Lebanon, especially now in the last 10 years, it has even expanded, more proliferated. And I have great friends there who make actually biodynamic wine.
Really?
Domaine
Fascinating.
Duval.
Are
Great
they in America,
guys,
the wines?
Yeah.
Some,
Yeah.
some are. I mean, the foundation is French, though. These are most of the wineries in Lebanon are old French monasteries.
Really? Okay,
Yes.
so that's where the
They
culture
they,
came
they
from.
started it. They're Jesuit monasteries, and then now they're corporatized.
amazing.
You know, the most famous one, actually, the one that really made Lebanon known to the world, and from San Francisco, this the distributor as well, is Chateau Musar.
Yes, everybody knows
And,
Chateau Musar, right?
yeah,
Oh, I've had
so
Chateau Musar, yeah, of course. Yeah.
And so Musar really made it an international phenomenon, but they make good wines. It's old world. Usually it's an interesting combination of Syrah and Cab. Usually it's 50-50, but they also throw in some Senso. So
Yes,
it's a
yeah,
very,
right.
very interesting combination in Lebanon.
I'm gonna have to get you guys the name of that Armenian restaurant because
Oh,
this
yeah.
is
Yeah,
a
I've
great
heard
addition
of
to
that,
that.
but what was the name? We should
I'll
go
get
there.
it.
Yeah.
So the story I was going to tell you is this picture here of my father and I is from 1975. But if you walk behind the door, my father's standing in front of you end up in this pharmacy around the corner. And so, I'm writing a story about my dad now. I'm having Mike Krikorian from the LA Times is interviewing him and writing some of the stories. And one of the stories is much like yours. When he was very young, and he was 7, 8 years old, his father would send him down the street to the wine shop. And the wine shop there in Egypt in 1949 or whatever, actually probably 42, was just a big vat of wine. And one was sweet and one was dry. And he was told to go get half a thing of sweet and half a thing of dry, and they'd blend it together, and he'd bring it home. But it happened to be in the pharmacy as well. So this picture is very prolific because
It started there.
yeah, it started back
That's
then.
wonderful. And these early experiences really become part of your identity.
Of course.
And I think that's what happened to me. It wasn't only, it was like holding your father's hand, going into the cave. It becomes almost a mythical experience for a 5, 6-year-old. So when we came to the US when I was 12 years old, I already dragged my mom to Trader Joe's to buy some very, very inexpensive
You got to
wine.
start somewhere.
Yes, and then as I started making a little money working at Seas Candies while I was going to Glendale High School, I
Wow.
would give more money to my mom to buy more expensive wines. And then later on, I became sort of a collector of initially French wines, and then I got into California wines.
No, that's great. Okay, so
So
Then
So
he
you're
got me hooked.
and then I know and now you're here having a great conversation about wine. Well, we'll get into the ethereal part of wine in a little bit because I want to establish this groundwork of how you ended up in Armenia because it's fascinating to me. And you talked to Hobbs,
yeah.
but it wasn't. It was quite a long time from that experience with Paul Hobbs' email to the find where you said, I think you were talking about like vignettes. What was it? You're going to cut up some property into smaller acreages and plant vines, which I'm not sure ever happened. But when did you think, I think I'm going to go to Armenia and plant vines? When did that come around?
Well, accidental. We can mention to Paul after the communication continued to visit. He asked him to visit Armenia, or if he would be open to visiting Armenia because I worked there. I was there every month. Paul said, "I'll be in Europe and I'll join you." He came. Vikan came. Discussions. I had some lands. He went and saw the land, and he said, in the Ararat Valley, he said, "You can make good wine anywhere, but for this land, I will not come to Armenia. I will not make exceptional wine in this area." So we took him to the Aghavnatsor area in Vayotsor, which is Armenia's wine country.
Yes.
He looked at the place and he said, "If you buy here, I'll come."
Really?
Yes.
So interesting.
Yes.
So he had his hand in the soil and he's looking at the rocks. and
He was really in the soil and did a lot of research afterwards as well. And the problem with the Armavir region was that it was getting too hot in the summer. although very cold, and they would bury the vines in Armavir, which was
Yeah.
another issue, but also very hot. So that
Even at night.
you know, that climate, he said, and the difference between morning and evening wasn't very great. He said the terroir itself is beautiful,
Yeah.
but that's not gonna
not
do
the
it.
whole thing,
It's
yeah.
not. It's not the quality. So when we went to Southwest, our current vineyard that we purchased is at 1,350 meters. So we're talking about 5,000 feet
4,000.
That's really high.
elevation, and it's almost right across that RNE1 cave where they found evidence of winemaking
6,000-year-old
that was
winery.
6,000 year old. So we're right across it, and
That's phenomenal.
imagine people try to make up stories. Armenia has a real
I don't
story.
believe that.
It's,
Armenia's making up stories.
Yeah, so Armenia has a real story.
We finally have
There's
a real
there's
story on
real
wine.
narrative about winemaking in Armenia. So I think Paul was enamored by the country, by the
Yeah.
people, and when he saw that piece of land, he said, maybe, why not?
I think I said this to Juliana. I had a master sommelier here. His name is Emmanuel Kamiji. He makes wine in Purerat and in the Santa Lucia Highlands. And he was saying he had gone to Daryl Cordy's store in Sacramento, and Daryl said, "You got to taste some of these Armenian wines." I don't know which he poured. And his comment was very interesting. I think you heard it last time, but it was, not only do I have to learn how to understand these wines, because the areas you're talking about now are going to be new to any wine person, and it's a whole new districting of appellations that the wine enophile needs to understand eventually.
Absolutely.
Right? He goes, I have to compete with them now, because he goes, they were really good. He goes, they were really good value, and now he says, I'm making wine in Spain, and I've got to figure out how I'm going to compete with wines in Armenia. So that's a huge testimony from a guy with his background and his education. So
I mean,
what did you do then? At this point, what did you?
I mean, there's two things that are worth mentioning. One is that Paul said, I don't want to be your consultant. I want to be a partner. I want to participate
Really?
in the project.
Oh,
yes.
okay, so hence his name on the bottle.
His name is on the bottle.
The name is on the bottle, and that's a measure of his commitment to the project and to the country. That's one important. The second thing is his style of doing everything perfectly. So upon his request, we invited two UC Davis PhDs to Armenia, who came, visited, tested, took samples to their labs, did the testing, and they said they gave incredible grades, and they said you can make good wine here.
Wow, from the soil. They
From
did
the
their
soil,
coring
yes,
and
yes.
all
They
that
all came to UC Davis, to their labs in Argentina, two UC Davis
amazing.
PhDs. He doesn't cut corners. He made sure that everything is
Well, I
done.
think you need to do that nowadays, right?
And the design of the vineyard was done by one of the most successful
So
vineyard
that's in order
designers.
to get the best facing sun exposure to the
Exactly,
vines
exactly.
and canopy and stuff. This is a fascinating thing, since you like French wines. I asked the same question of Burgundy makers in one in particular, Albert Bichot's company, and that is, in Burgundy, you see the terroir from the south to the north. It changes radically, and it changes radically from the east to the west in each subdivision. So they have these very small appellations, right? And they only grow one grape. So the only difference between one vineyard to the other is where the grapes end up, where the roots end up, and that produces the grape, right? The wine. And so this is fascinating about Armenia, because they're in there and they're saying, what are we going to find down there to influence the character of this wine? And I'm very fascinated to hear the terroir was so important with this bottling.
It was very important, and one other element that was important is that we purchased a lot of great cuttings from Argentina, from France, if I'm not mistaken, from Napa, and we imported them to Armenia, and we planted them in a nursery, and the intention was to use those for wine as
French varietals.
French varietals. But since that was going to take time, we said, let's start with Areni. Areni was available. And first year it was made, he tasted it, and he said, I think I'm going to go with Areni.
Really?
Yes.
At some point when we were
That
in
is amazing.
Armenia, I said, Paul, are we going to wait like for 5 years till these vines start producing? Why don't we just work with Areni? Let's source some grapes. Said, okay, let's do it. So
That easy, huh?
so we did that as a test, as an experiment, but that became our 2014 inaugural vintage because it was
Which
fantastic.
the other night when we opened it at the doctor's house, I was fascinated by it. It was totally different wine than when it landed here,
Yeah.
in my opinion. But so, what was his comments then, as this winemaker from who's experienced most of the world when it comes to grapes and clusters and sugar content and pH and skin thickness, all the rest of the things that come with picking a grape? Was he just absolutely enamored by this idea?
I think that he was enamored by the potential.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, he knew very well that there's a lot of work ahead, and it's not going to be easy. And he's not known as someone who would just go the easy route, but he was absolutely sure about the potential. He was fascinated by the story. I mean, he loves that cave every time. And when we first went, that cave was it wasn't an open cave where tourists would go. So we kind of went and jumped the fence. So we're
like little kids now.
Yeah.
Right.
So he went in, and then we had to follow him so that
Great.
it was fantastic. He was fascinated with that cave. And then as we came out, there were some old men sitting there and drinking vodka. And they told us, why don't you join us in Armenian? And Paul said, what is he saying? He said that he wants us to join them. So we joined them, and we started getting drunk together. And these men are talking to Paul in Armenian, and Paul is responding in English. They have no clue what they're saying, but they're loving each other.
That's so funny.
I mean, that became...
What a picture.
So for him, it became kind of a pilgrimage every year, twice a year. And that's I think that's the romantic story behind it. But the work itself, it's a very tough, grueling work that has ended up in this bottle. And then, interestingly enough, the parallel is that as we took Paul there, Michel Roland was visiting and working with Mr. Ernekian and Karas, and then Zora was working with Antonini, came after us. So there was this convergence of big names on this very small point on the global map, which is called Armenia.
Yeah.
And I think that's the beginning of the potential. And at that time, no one drank wine in Armenia in 2004. Now you have wine bars everywhere.
I've heard this.
And
now.
they're packed.
European in downtown.
Packed.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, all young people. So the trajectory is amazing.
I think that's great. So, and I want to peel some of that back too, because America's got a slightly different problem when it comes to the young people drinking wine. It's a whole different mentality. But so you planted then? Now you bought some acreage and you planted, and so.
Yes.
But you said it takes 5 years to get a crop that's worth a damn to use, right? So when did you buy and when did you plant?
We planted some 5 years ago, if I'm not, no, 4 years ago. 4 years ago. We took our time preparing the soil. Huge rocks were taken out. It took a long time.
Obsidian up there?
Boulders.
Is the black rock up there?
Not black, white.
Limestone,
yeah.
Volcanic.
It was a lot of work. The posts were designed by Paul. We did everything right. Drip irrigation, imported.
There was no drip irrigation in the now
at that time.
Yeah.
So after we put in all of that, now we're talking about possible dry farming. So we'll see.
Okay, so here, this is good. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's one of the misnomers I think that people don't understand. I think dry farming is a very important part of the business. It's certain parts of the world it's required. I don't know that it changes the value of a wine. I mean, you've got to have water. There's some parts of the world that if you try to grow grapes, you're going to have raisins if you don't water.
That's right.
But some of the consumer side of things, they're trying to explain to people that if they're not dry farmed, they're not natural. I'm like, what's unnatural about water? I mean, this isn't making sense, right?
Exactly.
Like, what's unnatural about a vine in the ground producing fruit, and that you ferment naturally with yeasts? They're natural. Like, even yeast that you buy are natural yeast. They're not manufactured. They're from the grapes. They're from grapes. So I've never figured that out. But I think what you have to do is what's going to be good to make good wine. That's what you want to do. You want that experience to be a good experience. to drinking wine, particularly when you're going to compete with what's out here in America. So you planted the grapes. Have you harvested any of those grapes yet?
We haven't because there's a small section that's ready to be harvested. It's interesting to know if we'll use it this year.
Yeah.
I'm getting the pictures. They look nice. I will be going there next week again. The story after we made this, and we have planted, we have experimented. So we have in the ground, we have some Cabernet Sauvignon, we have Cab
That's
Franc,
exciting, actually.
we have a little Sauvignon Blanc, we have a lot of Chardonnay, we have Syrah, we have even Pinot Noir. And then after we did this RNA, we kind of went to the indigenous route, and we planted a lot of local varietals, mainly RNA, and then white varietals. So we're converting the whole vineyard into an indigenous grape. So a part of it will be European varietals. Ultimately, we might use it for blending, but the program has turned into an indigenous grape plant. So we have planted only about 14 acres right now. We have another
Of how many?
Of double that. I mean, we have
That's
7.
30
We have planted
acres.
7 hectares.
Yeah, 40,
Total
50
is
acres.
18 hectares. So
So that's the interesting thing, because if you had asked me 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we're going to make Areni, I would have said you're crazy. Why not? Why aren't you?
We said in the beginning.
Yeah, why aren't you planting Merlot? And I still think Juliana's doing the right thing by having some of those things out there to try, because this marketplace is very tough, particularly California. It's very tough. In fact, I was very proud, really, and interested to see that now, and you have Chambers and Chambers selling some of your wines, but those are some of the first Armenian wines that have regular channels of distribution other than ethnic distributors.
Yes.
I frankly think that Victoria's making a mistake using Beaumont, because they are ethnic guys, right? They're nice guys. I like them, but they bring me plastic cups to taste the wines in. All right, that's what they do. They don't understand, which is fine. But to see Kush with Garber, and to see you guys with Chambers, and even Mosaic, I think Gaspar has a couple things cool, right?
I mean, Paul, I
huge thing.
don't mean to interrupt, but we have Verity in New York, Winebow in Chicago.
Oh, you have Winebow too?
Yeah.
So
we're with Winebow.
That is, I suspect the celebrity of Paul Hobbs is an important part of that, but they wouldn't do it if the wines weren't of caliber, right? They're not going to put it in the book because there's too much to sell already, right?
Yes.
Too much to sell. And the other reason I'm fascinated by this is I went to a tasting in New York called the Leading Wines of the World, which is, I think, probably not a good name, but it's a wine tasting for people that want representation in America. And so I spent a lot of time at the Macedonian table, and I spent a lot of time at the Moldavian table. Those wines have been around forever, and they're still trying to get here. There's more Armenian wines in Los Angeles than I think any other smaller ethnic group. Right? I don't see any Moldavia. I see a little Croatian wines, which are very good. Yeah. I see some, of these smaller countries, but the Armenian wines are making a presence, and I think it's because, this determination, like you two, to make it happen.
And we were in good restaurants. We are in good restaurants as well. I had dinner at Gwen yesterday, and I had one of our wines. Yeah. We were at Boa. We're at Faith and Flower. Spago carried our white, and they're out of it. Huge. They're out of it. We're getting the new ones.
So I remember when you were at the parties and we talk. I got doing this thing, and I thought, I'm like, what the hell, right? and I'm really happy to hear the story about Paul Hobbs and how it came around, because it's a real honest, sincere story of a passion to do this. So now, do you guys have this passion? Is the wine passion consumed you now?
Unless it consumes you don't do it.
You can't do it.
Without passion, this business cannot be executed. I think it has to be coupled with passion and patience.
Because you've already determined you can't make any money in the beginning.
We know this, right? It's for the future. It's for the future.
Well, this
is a family business for generations. The first generation puts in the sweat, and the following generations hopefully will benefit.
I think any project like this starts with some pioneering. And it's a big word, but I think that we're the pioneers in this project.
It's true, and it's really exciting to see you guys do this. I think Michel Roland told Juliana, until it's 100 years old, we really don't know what it's going to do.
Yeah,
so
that's
that's a little concerning, but
I
it's
would
okay.
expect the French to say that.
Yes, that's right. So I want to go back to the farming of this, because so much of wine, I mean, wine is where it's grown, and it is part of it. Wine should express that, right? That's particularly grapes like Pinot Noir, which are known for that. But Arani seems to be of that ilk. It seems to be, it's not this robust grape that jumps out of the glass full of tannic acid like Cabernet, but it has some finesse and elegance about it. And I love it because, in being in the wine business, I don't want somebody to say, tastes like Syrah, tastes like Cabernet. It shouldn't. It should taste like Arani, right?
Yes.
So what was Paul's sort of, why did he choose Arani? Why did he think this was so elegant or so interesting? Was there something in the character? Was it do you remember?
I think that it was a new grape for Paul as well. I mean,
that's
for
true.
all of us. So I think that, and the natural inclination is to try to find a point of comparison and reference. And as I taste this with sommeliers and so on, everyone is trying to compare it with something.
Can't do that.
Someone might say Chinon, another one might say Gamay, and then
I love that.
Syrah, is it Cabernet, is it I think that there's some Grenache, Northern Rhone Grenache.
I love that.
But a lot of people talk about when you drink ours, there's a lot of elegance and there's a subtlety, although it has the tannins, they're very soft. And that, as you said so correctly, sometimes I say, what does it doesn't compare to anything, because Arani predated all of these grapes.
Yeah.
So you should ask the question, does Cabernet taste like Arani? One day that should be the question.
That's the real question.
Yeah,
We'll work it backwards.
historically that would be the right question.
Yeah.
So, but it's interesting when we try to compare it. What does it taste like? And it's very subjective in that sense. But it is made right, so that's why
that's why. Difference.
And when we initially, Vi has a story. Why don't you tell that story? How the wineries were in Armenia when we first went with Paul.
Well, before Paul, I was taken to a winery. Actually, I was with your mother-in-law to get up.
The one time I went, I was there.
This was 1999.
Oh, really? Wow. Okay.
Yes, they took
only
us
11 years after independence.
Yes. They took us to less than 8 years. They took us to Get Up Winery. They were trying to convince us to buy it. I had seen it. It was a disaster. So when Paul came, we decided to tour the region, and this was in the heart of the wine country. We took him there before we went down to the cellars.
Yeah.
I told him, listen, Paul, you're going to be shocked.
That was risky.
He looks at me, he says, nothing shocks me. When I went to Argentina some 20 years ago, I saw everything, so nothing will shock me. So we went down. He looks around, then he looks at me, he goes, I'm shocked. And
that's funny.
they had these metal containers in which they made wine, oxidized, rusty,
Which
sweet
would be
wine.
very popular today.
Yeah, right.
And taking out the wine with a hose in a plastic jar.
Siphoning with a
So
diesel motor hose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We tasted it, and I go, I'm gonna get sick. And Paul looks at me. He goes, Vahe, if this old winemaker with zero international experience
Right.
is making this wine with this equipment, we can make wine in this country. That was his
like
conclusion.
his first thing.
Yes. He tasted
Before you'd gone to the land, before you'd gone to the vineyards.
we had seen the region
you'd seen a little
already.
bit, okay.
But he tasted the grape
Yeah.
in the bad wine.
Yes.
And
you
he
saw
says
through the bad
it
stuff.
Exactly.
it has potential. So years pass, we start making wine, and one of the main local winemaker who works with Paul is sitting around the table. I told this story. So this gentleman, Armand, looks at me, he goes, you know,
Talented winemaker, young,
very talented,
Armenian.
French educated, from Armenia. He looks at me. He goes, "You know who that old man was?" I go, "Who?" He goes, "My father." They're
you
from the
imagine
region,
this?
generation
That's
after
phenomenal.
generation.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a great story.
But the guy was dedicated enough, the old guy, to winemaking. He sent his son from Armenia to France to learn
Wow.
winemaking.
So that's the passion,
Yeah.
right? That's the passion. Because I was there in '06, and of course, on the bus with my mother-in-law. Where were we going? I forgot where we're going. And, we got to stop at the winery, and I'm like, oh, please don't. I really don't, because what I've seen so far, maybe it's a little snobby. And then, but two things have happened since then that have really fascinated me. But so they were concrete vats and they were open vats, but they had been repaired with like Henry's roof repair, big black tar things, and the guy's making wine. And then you have to tell the guy, yeah, it's really good, right? You taste the wine, and what the Armenian is going to say, what do you think? You're not going to criticize it. So you have to tell him it's really good when you can't even swallow it, right? It's just really bad. And he gives us stuff to take home. I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't even want this in the car.
In Coke bottles.
Yeah, right. This is bad. But and you stumbled across part of it. I was talking to Piero Incisa, who makes wine in Patagonia as well. And he's a very famous. His grandfather invented Sassicaia, big winemaking family. He actually redesigned the concrete vats, very similar to the ones I saw in Armenia. He makes them wider and shallower, so he has more exposure because it's biodynamic, and that's the way he likes to do it. And then you think about stuff like amphora.
Yeah,
Right? Now that's coming back.
definitely.
Now, when you guys are, you make this at Kushgarian's place, right?
Yes.
So oak, amphora, what is it?
So
Concrete?
no, it's stainless steel for this one that we have. This is our RNE one, and then we have the Sarpina, which is the reserve again, 100% RNE. But that one goes into used French oak for about
neutral French oak for
not neutral, second use.
okay, so it's not
Yeah,
a
so
little bit influence.
it has oak. You can taste the difference, but this goes directly from aged in stainless steel. So it's a very modern winery, the one we use.
And
so
we
don't use
own the
amphora.
tanks. It's
So-
Yeah, you buy the
just
tanks.
condominium
We own
type
the
of.
tanks.
Well, that's
and the
kind of
barrels.
testimony to the grape's versatility. If that you can, you're brave enough to try both, because you could waste a lot of money on oaking something that doesn't respect oak,
Exactly.
and also made stainless steel out of it. And you came up with two different wines.
Exactly.
That's fascinating.
And this is the stainless steel one. I think that it's really a good expression of the terroir.
So with the farms now that you're buying the grapes from, are you participating in its trellising, or how you want the,
Yeah.
if Paul
Well-
Hobbs says I want this to be more sun, whatever.
Exactly. So we manage it as much as we can, working with the farmer who owns the land. So we have, but you need to appreciate that it's an existing vineyard that's been there for maybe 15 years or 20 years, right? So we make the necessary adjustment for our purposes. So we oversee that as much as we can with the pruning and all of that, but especially with the harvest. Initially, when we went there, people used to harvest very early when the grapes were still
Because
heavy.
they sold the grape and they
sold
wanted
it
weight.
early. So this first 2014 vintage, they were actually picking grapes, cutting them in the middle, taking pictures, sending it to Paul, and Paul will look and says, "Keep it, don't harvest."
Wow.
And the villagers were going crazy. They
Yeah.
said, "What are you doing?" So
Nuts.
I was there at some point, and I went to the vineyard. You had like many vineyards next to each other, no fruit on them. There's only one in the middle, fruit hanging. Our vineyard.
Very low
and
yields.
They didn't know. Yeah, they didn't know who I was, and I would ask, "What is this? Why are they?" Say, "I don't know. Some crazy Americans came and they're not harvesting."
Okay, that's hilarious.
So we started
That's hilarious.
harvesting.
And we, to compensate for that, we pay them more. We tell them, "Don't worry about the lighter weight."
Oh,
so
of course.
sell us at the heavyweight.
Because they told us, the locals, be careful. They watered the night before harvest so that it goes heavier.
yeah.
Clumps up.
Oh,
So
That's
we
hilarious.
we compensate for that,
That's
and we
so
make sure.
the right time to harvest is usually mid-October.
really?
Yeah, for our
Last year it was late October.
We even went
Even
into
more-
early November.
yeah.
So
Going deep into the season.
now you
yeah.
go to the region. Everyone's
Everything's
harvesting October.
Okay, that's funny.
Yeah. So that's why the quality is better as well.
Well, it starts
The
in the vineyard.
competition.
We know this, right?
Definitely.
In fact, one of the things I took away from my trip to the winery, I came home and I immediately went to the web to see if Araney was even vitis vinifera, because I thought there's no way that it was part of this classification because it was so bad. I mean, and of course it is, and that's an important feature of the wine, the grape. But I think this is an excellent idea that the Armenian culture, embedded in their ways, have now starting to see that, wow, we can produce some really good wines. And even the farmers that are so established in how they've done business all these years.
And
are
not even in a generation.
Yeah,
We're talking
starting to
about
see what's going on.
10, 12 years.
It's amazing. I mean, in the Soviet time, they used to kind of divide the countries according to what they will be producing in terms of the agriculture.
Yes.
And they said that Georgia, right next to us, Georgia, you produce wine. And Georgia makes decent
They make
wine
good
because
wine,
they
sure.
have a history with
Right.
the Saperavi and the other. So, and to Armenia, they said, you make brandy. You're not going to make wine. And Armenians have a great tradition of brandy.
They do.
They have beautiful brandy. So that's why they have the grapes, they have the terroir. They did not have the know-how to make the right wine. And after the independence, as these international figures came in and the competition really started, and we should mention also Vahe Köshkerian was instrumental in that movement.
Of course.
And suddenly now people are not competing for quantity, they're competing for quality, which is a great thing.
It seems like too that lifestyle is becoming part of this
Absolutely.
movement.
Absolutely.
Victoria has these jazz nights, and they have these. I don't know if they're doing, grape stomping or not, which is very funny because I had a winemaker in here from Paso Robles. He's so rustic. I mean, it's so biodynamic. It's like, it's crazy, right? I mean, they still stomp by foot. Okay, so, but for fun, for a lifestyle, right? You there comes the winery, you have a jazz playing, you stomp the grapes. It's this whole ceremony. It seems like that's what's happening. Besides the wine bars downtown in Yerevan, you're getting this whole lifestyle around the idea and the culture of wine.
And collecting and comparing is becoming a thing too.
That'd be interesting. Now, any experience with aged Areni that's of any quality yet?
Great question.
I mean, like in the old cellars of the Armenian guys, or the oligarchs of Armenia, anything, who knows?
Dry wine. They have a lot of very old sweet wines
Yes.
in their cellars.
But nothing like this.
Nothing like this. Nothing dry.
We're not going to know because they weren't made
That way, sure.
that way to start with. So old Arenis that I've drank, they're not really anything to rave about.
And they
But-
definitely don't age.
But I don't think those same wines were any good when they were first made.
No. they
So,
weren't. And
so
they don't get any
you
better.
need to look at the best wines right now and see what happens 20
Yes.
years down the line. That's why we need to keep some of our 2014s, which are getting older,
You
and
should.
see what's
Well,
happening.
there's plenty of acid, there's plenty of fruit. This should,
Yeah.
by all normal thing.
No,
but the
no
balance,
question about 7 to 10 years,
Yeah,
but it's
for sure.
interesting after that.
Yeah. I want to wrap this up for you guys. I know you got some place to go, and we're getting late here, but we could probably do this for another hour, if we continue on these subjects. But I want to kind of wrap this up with this ethereal part of wine, and I almost say this in every podcast, but I think it's really important, particularly for the consumer, who they're consumers that don't really care the academic part of wine. It's not that important. They just want a good glass of wine when they're ready to have it, right? And I'm changing my ways. I'm really getting academically interested in the subject, and I'm working on trying to get myself into the Master of Wine program to study the next few years, really get into the academic part as well as practical. But there's something I use Sandra as a skateboard all the time, because I go home from work and she says, I want a glass of wine. And she's not saying, I want to get drunk, unfortunately. She's saying, I want to disconnect or connect, disconnect from the day, connect to something else. And it's a very ethereal part. Even though the grapes are going deep to get their soil, their nutrients in their water, and they're sucking in all this wonderful character from that, and it's so that makes it as from the earth as it can be. Its experience is beyond that, right? It's a whole, and this passion that you guys have is representative of that same exact passion that's in the bottle, and that's what people have to feel when they drink a bottle of wine, and it's mental, it's a academic in their head, it's intellectual to a certain part, and it doesn't have to be for everybody. I don't know if you guys agree with this or not. It doesn't have to be intellectual for everybody. You don't have to want to learn more, but you certainly know, I think, inside when you feel what passion went into the bottle.
Absolutely. I mean, you said it in such a wonderful way, Paul. I bet you, if I ask you now, do you have a memory of a specific moments that you had a specific wine? I'm sure you have many of those memories. So they get, and you're right. I mean, it's almost in psychology we call it gestalt, and the experience is really the end result is much more than the sum of its parts.
That's right.
So
the whole is greater than its parts.
yeah. So it's really a gestalt type of experience where the wholeness of it, which cannot be articulated completely,
That's right.
is something bigger than the pieces that make it.
That's absolutely right. And so my favorite story is like, it happens all the time, but it happened recently. Somebody went to Italy, and I said, when you get a wine you like at a restaurant, take a picture of the front and the back label in case there's the import statement on it. And I ordered for them, and then they get it here, and they say it doesn't taste the same. And I said, it doesn't taste the same because the experience is different. It's the same juice, it's the same alcohol, it's the same acid, everything's the same, but what's different is the experience you're going through as you tasted it, and that's the parts that you remember. It becomes a whole package. So what's next now? This is the 2015. You said the 16s are on the water. Is that what you said?
16s
red
are on the water,
and 17 white.
Wow. So in 15 and 16 we did not like the grapes for the white, so we did not make the white.
Wow.
So we made it again 17. And we will continue with the whites. So we have also the Sarpina, which I don't have here, and the Sarpina is the higher level. It's the reserve, again, a special part of the vineyard, hand-picked, hand-sorted, all of that, and that goes in the oak as well.
But the 16 stainless steel's on the water, or also this?
Both.
They're both on the water.
They're both on the water, plus the white, and then we have a plan to make a rosé.
Really? Well,
this
hot product right now.
19 vintage. So I've told them to start looking for that possibility. So I'll convince Paul, hopefully, and I think that's going to be interesting. I didn't tell Vi, but we should make some rosé.
We need some more money, by the way.
but the good thing is that rosé, you don't have to age. You can sell it right away.
Right. People love it. It's a hot product.
One historical thing that's worth mentioning, our so-called reserve is called Sarpina.
Yes.
And it's important to explain where Sarpina comes from because of the historical element involved in our wine experience. One of our cousins was here from Germany. His name is Vahe Tashjan, and he's the owner and editor of hushamadian.com, which is a digital bank of all things Armenian from the past.
The toughest website URL I've ever heard.
Hushamadian is memory book. Memory, that's what. He has biographies in there, pictures, old songs, and everything deposited under names, families from Western Armenia. And he was visiting us, and we were looking for names, and we asked him. He smiles. I go, why? He goes, I just received a book written by a priest in 1926. He was a refugee from the region of Palu, which is an agricultural area in historical Armenia. He became a priest after. He remembered everything about their land cultivation and had a chapter on each product. And on their vineyard, he explained in detail the distance between the plants and everything. And he used a word, that's the stick on which the plant grows. It's called Sarpina.
Wow, that's great.
They call it's an Armenian. Story. It's an Armenian. The Armenian name of that stick.
That is really
Sarpina.
Cool. That is really
so
cool.
we put it on the.
What an interesting story, and what a fun memory of what was happening way back when. It always fascinates me these old stories from the 20s, even before that, even the 1800s, 1700s, what they knew, what they really knew. They didn't have the chemistry we have. They didn't have all this stuff we have to analyze stuff, but the monks of Burgundy knew the difference between Gevrey Chambertin and the next door. They all knew that. How did they know that? But except from experience and going over and over. So I'm looking forward to the day when you have now your main brand and the Sarpina. But you also have your second brand, which is the younger grapes of the vineyard. So after you start picking your grapes and you plant new vineyards, those first few vintages are going to be of those grapes are going to be your second label, much like the Bordeaux people do, and they'll have a brighter, fresher character about it. And you'll have this whole product line of the Yacoubian Hobbs stuff, and we'll be able to just experience and taste and compare and even have verticals.
Thank you. I that's because I think about that often. For second line, YH2.
YH2, that's great. Yes, he's got a name already.
So I've been thinking about that, and I agree with you.
That's really exciting.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
I'm glad we had a chance to chat. It was a last minute thing, so to speak, but really good to see you guys. I'm glad to hear the story because it forms. When you taste this wine now, it's going to have a different impact, right?
That's right.
Thank you so much, Paul.
You're welcome.
Thank
Cheers.
you.